Welcome to EV Hub Live. EV Hub Live is a live video podcast for public policy professionals working to advance transportation electrification. EV Hub Live is recorded live, so to tune in and ask questions or check the schedule, please visit atlasevhub.com/live. In this episode, Nick Nigro will sit down with Arianna Skibell of Politico and Jennifer Hiller of the Wall Street Journal to talk about their experience covering electric vehicles. They'll discuss the EV stories that both journalists have covered, how covering transportation electrification differs from other beats, and covering the EV transition in 2022. This episode is produced by Peter Benzoni and Tom Taylor of Atlas Public Policy. All right, thanks a lot, Peter, and welcome Arianna and Jennifer to EV Hub Live. And happy beginning of 2022 to everyone out there. It was a very bumpy start for us here in DC. I hope things were better for you wherever you are. But February's off to a little bit better, I hope. So here's hoping things get back to normal a little bit as time goes on. So we're going to jump right into it. We've got two of my favorite reporters covering transportation electrification. We're going to start with Arianna. Back a little bit ago, you wrote this really great piece on U.S. Postal Service and how the USPS has been looking at electric vehicles for a long time, which probably came as news to a lot of your readers. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that story, how it's relevant today. There's a flurry of news from the Postal Service right now coming from some criticisms on the Hill and as well as the administration. So give us a little context on that story and tell us how it connects to what's happening now.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So I was actually reporting a different story about a model of electric Ford Rangers, a limited kind of, I think there were 1,500 of them in the 90s. And I was talking to a guy who makes it his business to repair these Ford Ranger EVs. Mm-hmm. And he was, they're kind of like collector's items. And he said, yeah, I spoke to a postal fleet manager somewhere who had a bunch of them that he had just forgotten about, and I was able to buy one. And so I was like, well, what was the USPS doing with these electric Ranger delivery trucks? And started doing some digging and found out that actually USPS first experimented with electric vehicles in 1899. And the gas-powered cars were a little bit faster. And so the Postmaster General said they were going to go with that. But throughout the last 120 years, USPS has sort of been experimenting with limited pilots of EVs. And the largest one was in the 90s. They contracted or they had said they were going to buy 6,000 EVs from Ford to start electrifying their fleet. And then it was the late 90s. And when 9/11 happened, USPS had to actually divert resources to deal with some of the anthrax scares that were happening. People were born in the 2001, so they may not remember, depending if you're how old you are listening to this or watching this. But so USPS has been experimenting with electric vehicles for a very long time. And what they've found over and over again is that they're really good vehicles for delivery routes. Delivery routes are predictable. The vehicles go and live in one place at night where they can charge. It's an easier ride for the drivers. It's and there's a lot of public health benefits. You're not sort of the belching that happens with every start and stop that a delivery vehicle makes. Obviously releases a lot of toxic pollutants in neighborhoods. So we're at this sort of, if you look back through the history, we're back at this crossroads again, where USPS sort of has a decision whether or not it's going to invest in electric vehicles. And so far, the answer again is kind of, but not really.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that came as quite a bit disappointment to a lot of the folks in the policy community because the numbers seem like they should be better than what that USPS had put out a what they call an environmental impact statement, and the numbers look really bad for EVs according to their math.
Yes, yeah. I think the difference today, that perhaps was not relevant, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago was obviously the climate crisis and administration
Hmm.
that is really trying to throw its weight behind electrification. Um, from where I'm sitting, it sort of seems like the administration is running out of ways to intervene with a
Hmm.
strong arm. But yeah, I think we will see.
Yeah, for sure. Jennifer, let's bring you into the conversation. Not necessarily talk about USPS, but more some of the stories you've been covering. Story you worked on last year on cost of charging, key top of mind issue for everybody who's considering buying an EV. It's a complicated story. We actually gave you some help with some of that bits, but this is a really new thing for a lot of customers, and so or potential customers, I should say, for EVs. Were there any kind of findings from that story that came as a surprise to you and as the reporter?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on today. And thanks for your data assist with that story. I
Anytime.
appreciate it. I think we definitely had surprises come up in the data. And our idea and the approach was just electricity is this sort of opaque and strange thing as a consumer. Nobody really understands their monthly utility bill. It's just this a bunch of strange numbers that you get and you pay it and you're done. And gasoline is, just one of the most visible things that we purchase. It's there on big signs, kind of in your face everywhere you go. And exactly, I know what a gallon of gasoline is and how much that's going to cost. And so we were just curious, if you're asking drivers over the next several years to sort of switch to electric vehicles, like what does that mean in terms of the consumer experience and how should we think about that charge? How do we think about like charging up, or what does it mean or cost to sort of fill up an EV? And I knew that there was going to be variation, but honestly, I was surprised at how much the costs varied across the country and how much more savings you got in certain areas than others. I don't know that I don't know. It was just sort of stark.
Do you mean the difference between like charging in the public and charging at home?
I think we knew that, public charging was going to be maybe more, quite a bit more costly than home and would either be, close or more expensive to buying gasoline. But it was the at-home charging. I thought that was kind of surprising that, drivers in a place like Spokane that has, cheap electricity, but kind of expensive gasoline come out, over time, just thousands of dollars ahead in EV. And in other parts of the country, it was, you still had savings, but if you were looking over like the first 100,000 miles of driving or so, there was areas of the country where you might save $9,000 and areas of the country where you would save maybe $4,000, which is I thought that was a big difference.
Yeah, no, it's probably going to be hard for people to, do that regional specific calculation, right? And that's one of the challenges I think the autos are going to face, right? As they try to make the case for, the part of the premise, I think, of that story was there was the opportunity to save money when you're charging. How much money kind of depends on a lot of factors.
Yeah, it depends. And you kind of have to go through some mental gymnastics to figure out what that sort of regular maintenance type cost, is going to be every week or two.
Yeah, I mean, and that it's that kind of data and information that is kind of ripe for disinformation and misinformation. People trying to skew things one way or the other. Arianna, you've been tweeting about that. We're lurking, following your Twitter feed, and you've been talking about that. Tell us a little bit about some of the other things that you think are going to be bubbling up in the EV land when it comes to folks who are not necessarily advocates of EVs, folks who might want to slow the transition down or stop the transition. What are you seeing there online?
Yeah, I mean, I think aside from cost, I think one of the major flashpoints is range, and EVs and hybrids have been around for a while, and a lot of those older models, the range is around 100 miles or something like that. Whereas models that are coming out this year, you have a range that's over 300 miles. So that's quite a difference. So I think maybe the story you're referring to is after the I-95 freeze in Virginia. A lot of people were talking on the internet, as they do, about how, thank goodness people were in gas cars and not EVs, because all the EVs would have died and we would have had this, mass, just catastrophe. Who knows how that would have been solved. And so there was this really wonderful, smart reporter who was like, well, let's test it out. And he did an experiment where he sat in an EV in his driveway for 12 hours in the Midwest. And it was kind of remarkable. Obviously he's not a scientist, and there were, conditions that maybe weren't totally similar, but a lot was comparable, and found that I think over 12 hours, he lost 25% of his battery. So if, 24 hours would have been 50%. And I think, what really struck me is just how he said he got a lot of hate mail for that. And I think, with new technology, there's always going to be a lot of hesitancy and a lot of fear. And I think just, knowing that an EV today is different than an EV 20 years ago.
Yeah. I short of reporters sitting in cars freezing, trying to disprove some rumors. What are other things, to both Jennifer and Arianna? What are other things you think you all have to do? We're in this era now where somebody could write a tweet or write a post somewhere online, and then it becomes truth, whether or not it has a lot of basis in fact. And so this new technology we're talking about, EVs, is very complicated for a lot of people for the reasons, Jennifer, you were talking about too, just with charging. So what do you think is the role of you all in trying to help dispel these kind of half-truths, falsehoods, whatever you want to call it? Jennifer, what do you think?
Well, that's a hard question. I think really just probably getting more stories out there and more information is always important. And the way that things can become quickly politicized and kind of take on a life of their own remains very surprising to me. But I think a lot of this is just going to take time. I mean, a lot of people are still not very familiar with EVs. There's still a really small share of what's out there. And I think until a lot of people are either driving them or their friends and neighbors have them, and you get that sort of like word of mouth experience, it's going to be something that people distrust and are going to see as just, kind of a more elite or expensive product until it's really out there in volume. I think there's just going to be probably some mistrust.
You came from oil and gas before covering oil and gas before you switched over to transportation electrification. What are some of your early findings on that and the difference between covering these two issues?
I mean, there's a lot of similarities, honestly, all kinds of energy sort of, there's a lot of similarities, I think, between different parts of the energy industry. And there's not as many, I think, like hard and fast lines as a lot of people would imagine between oil and gas and renewables, and a lot of interesting work being done by a lot of companies. I mean, that said, I think everybody on, I hate to use the term both sides, but I feel like everybody is very dug in on their position and their technology. And if you're an oil and gas person, their view is that EVs face this really long adoption path, that it's going to take just an incredibly long time for that fleet, for like the fleets to really turn over, and that we will that people will be driving, gasoline and diesel vehicles for quite a long time to come. And I think on the flip side of that, the EV companies and people working in that space, I think, see a lot faster adoption. So I think there's just real differences of opinion on the time frame of
And
when
it's hard.
things happen, and like whether one thing makes another technology obsolete or not.
I can imagine it being hard for, in covering both sides of that. Like you mentioned dug in, and how dug in folks are these days on seemingly everything. It must be hard to be able to break through that. Arianna, what are your thoughts on, what is the role of media and journalists in trying to cut through that, and not just look at things from on the one hand and on the other hand, but there is a truth in a lot of the issues at hand here.
Yeah, I mean, sort of going off what Jennifer said, obviously there's a lot of mis and disinformation right now, and I wish there was an easy answer for how we could solve all of that as journalists. But I do think, so sort of what Jennifer was saying about exposure to electric vehicles, I think there was a Consumer Report study a couple years ago that found that people who had a neighbor or knew someone who had an EV or had themselves driven in an EV, I forget what the numbers are, but it sort of dramatically increased or reduced their resistance to electric vehicles, and their willingness to say they might be open to getting one, or and just everyone I think such a common refrain is like, once you've driven in an EV, it's or have one, people don't really go back. They love them. And just to say really quickly, one story I love talking to a farmer who had an electric Ranger was they had some sort of equipment that had fallen in a ditch, and they were able to hook it up to their electric truck. Because the torque is instant, they could pull it out of the ditch immediately, in a way where, they had this other diesel truck that they had been trying to use because it was so large and big, and it wasn't working because they needed that immediacy.
Yeah.
So I do feel like unlike other sources of disinformation, there is an opportunity for people to come, up and be in person with electric vehicles and understand them for themselves and have their own experience.
Yeah, I have to say, like, if you go on YouTube, you can see an incredible number of folks who do drag racing and other things with EVs to try to like line them up against each other and compare them to conventional technology. These folks are not they're not doing it for politics. They're doing it because that's like they're gearheads, as you call them. And like, they're just interested in cars. And it's a really good point that like just getting the technology in more people's hands will, almost naturally dispel some of the myths around them. Speaking of more tech in the hands, last year was a very high year relative to others, at least in the United States, for EV sales. Still pretty low, but in the last few quarters, we're looking at somewhere near 5% adoption nationwide. So Jennifer, to your point earlier, it's got a long way to go before they're the dominant tech in the auto industry, but it's a considerable growth from where we were just a year ago. So with that in mind, like, what are the kinds of stories, topics you guys think are going to be coming onto your plate for 2022? What are the areas of most interest for you? Why don't we start with Arianna?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I haven't explored so much, but I'm interested in exploring is especially with a lot of the sort of the emphasis on domestic supply chain that this administration has put forward, is how is mining for lithium, and how, I think historically mining has been sort of a separate issue from what automakers are dealing with, and And I think we're going to see a lot of, in the same way we're seeing crossover with the Department of Transportation and the Department of Energy trying to work together. How are we going to get all these EVs on the grid? I think we're going to also see this merging of mining and auto interests. So I think that's going to be a space to watch, as well as grid integration.
Yeah, totally. Supply chain stuff has been affecting not EVs necessarily. Every car has been facing struggles with it, and so you can imagine as the market grows, there could be supply constraints, and there's a lot of concern that we hear about with sourcing. The industry is much better about dealing with sourcing than they were. There's a lot more transparency on that, but I can imagine there's a lot of new tech here. So really good observation there. Jennifer, what are your thoughts? What are some of the things you think are going to be of interest to your readers?
Yeah, I think any emerging supply chain issues, or kind of like the efforts to build out a domestic mining industry, some of those things I think are going to be really interesting to watch, as well as just like the continued build out of public charging and trying to get that into rural areas and along highways, and just what that looks like, and how that, kind of how that money from the federal government starts to like filter down to states and to EV charging companies. And I'd say I'm not an autos reporter, but I'm really interested to see what happens when the F-150 hits the market, and how that changes, just the number and the kind of people who are willing to try an EV.
I saw some very impressive looking reservation counts from both Ford and GM for their Silverado electric truck. So I agree. It's gonna, this goes back to what you all were saying earlier about dispelling myths and whatnot, getting awareness. Truck segment's the biggest segment in the US. And so having some of them in the hands of those drivers, I think is gonna be an interesting topic for sure. I like that you brought up the infrastructure deployment too, though, because with the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, whatever you call it, this is a historic investment in EVs charging that's coming, at least from Washington here in the United States. And so what does that look like? Where's that money going? It'd be really, I'm interested to hear about how you all are going to be trying to cover it. Jennifer, you mentioned the deployment in rural communities in particular. I'd love to hear more about what you guys are thinking are going to be of most interest to your readers when it comes to the implementation of the law. Arianna, what do you think?
Sure. Well, in terms of the charging infrastructure, I think there's $5 billion that's for formula funding and $2.5 billion for competitive grants. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm kind of interested in watching is, and Jennifer probably knows more about this, but I think some states are certainly far ahead, a ways in ahead in terms of how much they've already done with charging infrastructure, and whereas other states really haven't started putting together any kind of blueprint. And I think each state, as I understand, is going to have to put out a plan, a 5-year plan for their charging infrastructure. And I think there are a lot of questions in terms of the speed of deployment that the Biden administration would like to see, and how ready states actually are to do that and to implement best practice and have sharing of best practice. And especially if you have states that are sort of reticent to be investing, worst case scenario, you have some states that have tons of infrastructure and some states that don't, and people can't really get back and forth.
Yeah,
I imagine that won't happen, but in my dystopic, imagination, that's kind of what I see. Yeah,
really interesting. I think even within states, you have this potential disparity between knowledge on EV charging. There might be the knowledge center might be the state energy office or the air agency, not the transportation department, which is the entity that's getting the money, or vice versa. Maybe the DOT is actually quite ramped up. It's really gonna depend on the state. So I think it will be interesting to see that there's a lot of formula money. So there's money that's going to going to go to the DOTs and should be spent. So how that gets done, I think, is going to be a real opportunity for investigation, I guess. Jennifer, what about you? Could you expand a little bit more what you were talking about a moment ago?
Yeah, sure. I would echo all of that. And, I think some of the states moved really quickly with the money that's already been available through like the VW settlement. And, they have kind of programs and a system set up and, wouldn't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, to distribute another round of federal dollars. And then, as you were both saying, others are kind of more early in this process. And when you kind of throw out, billions of dollars in formula funding, I think it's just going to be really interesting to watch and see who's moving quickly to deploy and who's, going slower. And I'm also curious, like if supply chain becomes a problem here too. I mean, there are a lot of EV charging companies out there, but when you try to put this much out at one time, I'm wondering if like log jams kind of develop there, or just kind of the ability of that industry to meet this demand.
Yeah. There is an uncertainty there for sure. We got some questions from a viewer on YouTube, which is a good question, I think, about some of the market opportunities. And we've been talking mostly about personally owned vehicles. Clearly, fleets are an emerging space. I think Ford just started delivering their electric transit vans. But this person was asking about emergency response vehicles, electric police, fire, and other vehicles of that nature. You've probably seen some occasional stories on the Tesla police car or whatever. But there's clearly a lot of vehicles on the road in this segment. And I wondered, is that of interest for you guys? And have you been hearing about them? Anybody? Either of you.
I've been hearing more about school bus fleets, to be honest, or transit fleets. But I think fleets broadly, whatever, whoever has them, are going to be kind of the first things that turn over, and start going towards 100% electric. And so I would, and it definitely, depending on, the city or state that you're in, would fit in with any kind of like 2050 goals that they might be setting locally. And, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of potential money out there on the table from the federal government now as well, that can go towards like paying for a part of those new fleets. And so, yeah, I think that's an emerging area to watch. And I mean, you do hear some interesting things on the bus side of things, and the ability maybe to use, it doesn't quite go to speak to like the police and fire question, but you hear a lot about, maybe school buses being used as emergency backup power, or to power emergency operations centers and things like that during storms, because they're usually sitting at the time when a really bad winter storm might be hitting, or a hurricane or something like that, and you have some available power there potentially.
Yeah, there's some great pilots that we've seen going on in that regard. Con Ed has one up in New York City. Arianna, you've been also covering Build Back Better. So speaking of potentially more sources of funding for EVs to help with these emergency response vehicles, what's your take right now? There's a lot of prognosticating out there online about the probability of it. So from your covering of the story, what's your take on where it stands and what the likelihood is of something moving?
Yeah. So I think the EV tax credits, which, just a quick refresher, right now there is a tax credit in place where I think you can get up to $7,000 or $7,500 in tax rebates for EVs from automakers that have not hit a cap of 200,000 EVs that they've already sold. So I think Tesla and General Motors have hit their caps. And the tax credits in the Build Back Better Act would have removed that cap. And they also would have added more incentives for electric vehicles made by unionized shops and domestically. Senator Manchin did not like the union. Many people did not like the union provision, but he has a lot of power in determining what gets included in that bill. And he made pretty clear that he would not sign off on legislation that included the union provision. So, President Biden has said he's thinking the Build Back Better Act will pass in some form, probably broken up into smaller bills. For never say never, but I would imagine it's pretty. It would be hard to see that 12,500 incentive included. I do think there's a chance for removing the cap and maybe updating some of the tax credits, but I think that whopping 12,500 is probably donezo.
Yeah, donezo. Nice.
Yeah.
So speaking of trying to get more folks into EVs, putting more money into them, one of the things that's difficult with the tax credit is it's a tax credit. So it's $7,500, which is obviously not a small amount of money. But if you have no tax liability, it might not be worth anything to you as a vehicle buyer. So that's a big concern for folks who care and work in equity related issues, low, disadvantaged, moderate income families and such. So Jennifer, I'd love to talk more a little bit about that and how is that emerging issue informing the kind of stories you're looking into?
I think there's all kinds of interesting equity issues across EVs, because on the one hand, you hear a lot of EV advocates saying, because of these lower maintenance costs and these lower fuel costs over time, it would be great to get EVs into the hands of lower income folks, that would be a better kind of car for low income families to own over time and would be less burdensome. But it's a price. There's so many issues here. Price is a huge hurdle. The availability of charging, whether you can charge, whether you have a garage in your home or your rental home or your condo or apartment. I think there's, plenty of, air quality issues, with equity when it comes to, I know that's one of the big discussions around, converting fleets of, transit or school buses, that it would be, one way to lower the air pollution burden in urban and poor communities. So it's, there's just a laundry list, I think, of equity questions that need to be answered around EVs. And I think there's definitely like a perception issue of EVs as a more kind of elite product that, it's probably, going to be a criticism that sticks around, I guess, maybe until a lot of them are on the road or until there's enough used ones out there. I don't know. Even you can't find a car anyway. There's so many stories right now about what a nightmare it is to go buy a car of any kind and how prices have just like skyrocketed and things like that. And
I also
wonder what that
I tend to think people, I tend to think people are kind of stuck in what did cars cost like 10 years ago or 15 years ago when they're looking at the price of EVs. But, people spend a lot of money on a new car today. And even before the supply chain issues, I think I was seeing some data where it's over $40,000 for the transaction price for a new car. I mean, my first car was $1,800. People are seemingly able to put a lot of money into these new vehicles. And there's a good chunk of them, of EVs at least, that are actually under that market, especially when you talk about the incentives. So another case maybe for some opportunity for dispelling myths, I guess. We'll see. Arianna, let's close this out here and talk a little, if you don't mind, addressing that last question on equity. How are you all looking at it from where you sit at E&E News?
Yeah, so I think with equity, when it comes to EVs, there's sort of the direct considerations that we were just discussing in terms of price, access to charging infrastructure, so charging in multi-unit dwellings, also, and then sort of a little farther out, the electrification of, in particular, freight, big heavy duty trucks that are using some of the most emitting some of the most toxic air pollutants. We know that low income communities and communities of color are disproportionately located in near highways, near freight corridors, near warehouses, where a lot of that big heavy duty trucks are driving to and from every day. And so there's both the climate issue of greenhouse gas emissions, and there's also just sort of the domestic smog and toxic air pollutants that are being released that are disproportionately impacting these people who live nearby. I think another equity issue that some people think we should be talking about too is, if we're going to have cars on the roads, those cars, it's more beneficial to the climate and to people's health to have those cars be electric vehicles. But there's also an infrastructure question of, are there ways to even if we're using electric vehicles, if we're going to expand roads, we still have to put down concrete. That has implications for climate. So do we need to be rethinking infrastructure in general and our use of vehicles, and if you live near a highway and there's no crossover, you might have to walk 2 miles out of your way
or drive.
That's the thing. So if you want to walk, you have to walk. It's going to take you an hour to get to the grocery store, whereas you could drive, get in your car, it's 5 minutes. If there was an underpass or an overpass or a boulevard or whatever, you might be able to walk in 10 minutes. If you're able, you might choose to walk. So I think that's also an equity consideration I'm looking at.
I saw some incredible pictures of a couple of American cities from the 70s, which shall remain nameless, about their land use and what it looked like. And it was just a sea of parking lots. So I hear you. I think that it's a undercovered issue because it's not quite as sexy of a topic to talk about land use and what is the impact of roads, but there's a lot of equity components to it. So that's a great, really, really good point. So we're a bit over time, so I want to wrap things up. I really appreciate both Jennifer and Arianna joining us on EV Hub Live. Thanks to Tom and Peter for helping produce. The show is going to be on YouTube and will be on Spotify and the other podcast apps shortly. So thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thank
Bye now.
you.
Thanks so much.